So I don't know what I'm going to be able to see.
Good evening and welcome to Intellectual Publics. We're coming to you live from the Graduate Center at CUNY. My name is Ken Wissaker and I direct the program with the invaluable assistance of Stephanie Gayette and Leslie Haynes, PhD students at the Graduate Center. And we're very fortunate to have with us tonight two brilliant feminist activists, thinkers, and friends, Chandra Mohanty and Linda Alcoff, on the occasion of the publication of Chandra Mohanty's fabulous and long-awaited, though right on time, entirely on time, Insurgent Visions, Feminism, Justice, and Solidarity. As she has done throughout her work, Chandra shows us how freedom struggles that might seem separate, dealing with capitalism, neoliberalism, and citizenship, race issues or Dalit ones, the US border or our Palestine, Israel, all are interconnected and need to be understood transnationally and through feminist epistemologies. This year, this week, this day, we all feel the challenges rising around us. The walls are higher, the difficulties more complex. We need this work and the work of feminist solidarities more than ever. Sarah Ahmed called the book a gift to all of us fighting for justice and freedom in times of escalating violence. We're lucky to be able to hear such guidance tonight, especially in the company of the incisive and brilliant Linda Alcoff. A special night ahead. For me, this is a little extra special. I was fortunate and honored to work with Chandra on her path-breaking Feminism Without Borders, Decolonizing Theory, Practicing Solidarity back in the early aughts, now a classic, and one of Duke University Press's all-time bestsellers. To have the follow-up now and the long friendship which has undergirded our collaboration could not be more of an honor. Chandra Talpade Mohanty is Chair and Distinguished Professor of Women and Gender Studies and Dean's Professor of the Humanities at Syracuse University. She is the author of Insurgent Visions, Feminism, Justice, Solidarity, which just came out this year, and Feminism Without Borders. And she's co-editor of numerous books, including Third World Women and the Politics of Feminism, a foundational text from University of Indiana Press in 1991, and several others. She was a member of the Indigenous and Women of Color Feminist Solidarity delegation to Palestine in 2011. Linda Martin Alcoff is professor of philosophy at Hunter College and here at the Graduate Center CUNY. She is past president of the American Philosophical Association Eastern Division. Her recent books include Race and Racism, A Decolonial Approach from Oxford in 2025, Rape and Resistance from Polity in 2018, The Future of Whiteness from Polity in 2015, Visible Identities, Race, Gender, and the Self, Oxford 2006, which won the Frantz Fanon Award for 2009. I'm going all the way back, Real Knowing, New Versions of Coherence Theory from Cornell in 1996, along with 11 edited or co-edited collections. So I'm very happy to welcome them both. We have the chat open, so feel free to comment and introduce yourselves. Professors Alcoff and Mohanty will talk until about 7:45 Eastern Time, and then we will open up for questions. If you would put the questions into the Q&A rather than the chat, that would be very helpful and will enable us to keep track of them. I'm really happy to welcome you all, and we'll turn it over to you, Linda. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. I'm so glad that you guys organized this event so that so many people could participate in this conversation. And I'm very honored to be doing this conversation with you, Chandra, about such a wonderful book. We've known each other and worked together for 30 years, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of the struggles. But I wanted to start us off giving a little bit of a sense of the book for those who are who haven't yet read it, which is probably most of the audience. It's really an amazing book it's a book of essays. So we get to see your developing thinking through time. There's 4 essays that are co-written with other people, but there's also like interweaving between the essays. So some of the essays provide supporting arguments for claims that are made in other essays. And the overarching unity of the book is gender justice, but what you show is that this requires change in every social sphere. I think the book as a whole shows that what we need to do, which can seem really impossible, can be done, which is to draw together the various crises we experience today, both internationally and nationally. And one of the concepts that you use often is global corporate capitalism. But what you show is that anti-capitalism is not enough if it doesn't attend to the local and specific national issues, racism, ethnic hatred, sexism, and other forms of oppression that divide groups. And it's just really rare to see an approach that links up all these disparate issues in ways that doesn't dissolve them into some sort of thin meta level analysis. You stay in the thick of the struggle and you show how to maintain a multi-axial approach. I also want to emphasize that the book develops the arguments drawn from a very deep and rich account of social movements and policy activism, drawing from both insiders and outsiders, especially from Latin America and from Asia. So the positions that you develop through the book are realistic. They're not pie in the sky idealistic. They're being debated and enacted in many local places already today, as you show, and in some transnational relationships. So what you do, I think, is it's a very concrete analysis that brings many social movements and institution building together, such as your discussion of the community-based monitoring system, the practices of Red Vita, and many others that show the possibility of connecting communities across social and geographical divides. And then, there's also a running critique of a lot of mainstream feminism that's going to be of great interest to a lot of feminists today. Key weaknesses that you show in current feminist and gender theory, but also the need, as ever, for the macro theorists of the anti-imperial left to center issues of gender more than they usually do. And I love, for example, the essay that you co-authored with Sarah Maraglia, who was your student and my student as well one time at Syracuse. It's a good example, I think, of this double-sided approach, which shows how the effort to achieve gender mainstreaming so that gender issues are incorporated into the constitutive features of how we think about things like economic reform, for example. But this gender mainstreaming has often been implemented in a way that falls short of changing the power imbalances. And in this essay, you and Sarah focus particularly on the idea of women's empowerment, which we see a lot of advertising for, women's empowerment, which is often done in a very decontextualized individual way with commodified public services providing the solution. And I think one thing I know we're going to want to talk about is your analysis of the threats of U.S. women's studies getting domesticated. Right now, U.S. women's studies is feeling like it's going to get wiped off the map, but it may be tempted to do a domestication in order to salvage itself. And I think what this book shows is that this is going to be the demise of women's studies. If women's studies tries to have a smaller, more narrow reformist focus, I think it's going to lose forever, as you show, the ability of the scholarship in women's studies to reveal the mechanisms that operate transnationally to maintain the extraction of women's free labor, useful consumerism, and so on. So, and you make this really strong argument that we need to take citizenship as an element that operates implicitly in feminist projects. So citizenship, the assumption that the the sort of agent of women's studies is a US citizen. And, it's true that women's studies has always been full of diverse and radical scholars, but it's the framing of the discipline that you call out, the framing of the discipline that works to legitimate its place in the academy in a way that makes it beholden to imperialism and capitalism, providing jobs so that we train people to become policymakers or organizational leaders in a neoliberal global gender justice market. So it's an amazing book that people must read. There's tremendous work in Borders and Bridges on Palestine here that's more relevant than ever. A lot of work to unpack the ideologies that conceal injustice and extraction and profit making, and the thin veneer of democracy that is touted within militarized nation states. And the global analysis is so important. This is the last thing I'll say, because these are not just challenges in the global north, as you show. Your detailed analysis of Kashmir helps us become less inclined to simplistic notions about where the problems are or the cause of the problems we face. So that's my plug for everybody to read this book and use it, as I know they will, in women's studies. Do you want to talk back to me at all before we begin the Q&A?
Well, first of all, just Linda, I'm so thrilled that you're doing this with me. And as I kept thinking and feeling, anxious about this, because I'm always anxious about public things, I remembered that I was with a really dear friend from many, many years, and that you and I have done so much work together over the years around very similar things institutionally and otherwise. So thank you for being here, and thank you, Ken, and everyone for inviting us to do this. I'm really excited and hoping we can really think through what are, I think, some really urgent issues right now in front of us. And interestingly, the book really, as you say, is a collection of essays written over a number of years. And for me, what that says is that even though, this goes through a number of years, some of the questions and the issues have remained the same. The way they've appeared and reappeared are different. And so we need to do analysis that actually addresses what the differences are, but also what we've inherited and what has remained the same and reproduced itself in terms of systemic injustices. So, yes, thank you for being here, and we can go straight into question.
Okay. I think that I want to start with this question about connections. I think all of these questions that we're going to discuss are relevant for the scholarly work that people are doing and the teaching work that so many of us are also doing, that requires making connections and collaborations in the work. This book makes so many connections between movements that are sometimes separated, in practice and in theory. And you connect anti-capitalism, anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, anti-racism, and feminism. You make this list on page 7 of the proliferation of carceral regimes, the geopolitical climate destruction, the militarization of national borders, the economic and political consequences of the massive displacement of peoples, the proliferation of corporatist racist, misogynist cultures, the decimation of labor movements, the rise of proto-fascist religious fundamentalism, the policing and surveillance of gendered bodies and sexualities. This is just to give people a sense of the breadth of things that you are pulling together. So could you say something about why you insist that these struggles must be connected theoretically? And I'm thinking primarily in terms of theory at this moment, but it's also organizationally, but also I think you show in the book that all these really kinds of diverse frames of analysis of what's wrong with the world and what's wrong with our societies need to be connected theoretically.
Yeah, just a small question, right, Linda? Okay. So yes, I guess have always believed that the best kind of feminist praxis needs to be understood at different scales simultaneously. So the best kind of, I think of feminist struggles as local, national, and international or transnational. That any struggle that one looks at, any system that is a system of a certain kind of violence or exploitation, etc. All these systems work at all these different scales and they support each other. These scales support each other. So, for instance, I'm thinking that, and for me, theory is really about how we make certain kinds of connections and how we show why the connections we are making are actually give us an accurate reading of what is happening, of how power in fact functions. So that's the difference between theory, thinking theoretically, and describing a situation. It's providing certain kinds of explanations and connections and modes of sort of seeing through lines among and between systems, right? So I think that this kind of a theoretical analysis, which makes all these connections, allows us to think, for instance, to think and widen the scale of analysis. So, for instance, what would happen if we thought about state violence on a much broader scale than how we think about it domestically or nationally, right? And what does that thinking of state violence and the creation of carceral communities and logics, which is happening around the world, right? What does that illustrate? And what does it say about the kind of feminist alliances, coalitions, solidarities that we really urgently must build in order to respond and push back against some of these kinds of struggles. So, for instance, in the end, in my last chapter, I actually go back to a concept that I spoke about 30 plus years ago, cartographies of struggle. And to me, what is interesting is how so many of the things that I worked on in the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s come back to me as formulations or frameworks that are still really useful in the context that we're in. So, for instance, the concept of cartographies of struggle, which I had talked about in relation to the politics of third world feminism at that time, right? Mm-hmm. I think it allows us to grasp how power works through interconnected histories of racial capitalism and labor flows. These are the large projects, right? Racial capitalism and labor flows, of colonial legacies, of heteronormative nation state projects of citizenship, which of course exist everywhere around the world, right? Um, and transnational and cross border movements and advocacy for economic and social justice. So, that notion of cartographies of struggle is something I use to sort of map all of these different large categories and systems, in particular, local, regional, national spaces, and look at what the connections are, right? I think this concept is useful because it kind of foregrounds the interconnected logics and mutual histories of colonialism, of racial capitalism, of what Harsha Valia has called border imperialism, of white supremacy, and the rise and consolidation of masculinist, religious fundamentalist, and authoritarian regimes now across the globe. So it feels like without seeing these connections, we are not going to be able to think our way out of the kind of chaos that we experience constantly, I think, right now. Both living in the US, the kind of stuff that's coming at us all the time, um, all of it has a history. I mean, what's interesting is that none of the things we are seeing now with Trump 2.0 are new, in fact. And the roots and the sort of logic of all of this has been a part of the building of the US nation state through settler colonialism and slavery and indentured labor and all of these things, the creation of particular understandings of citizenship and the nation. And again, it's something that you can't understand unless you understand how colonialism works, how colonial legacies work, how they are a part of the way labor is organized in capitalism, all of these kinds of things. So I don't know if I'm being too abstract right now, but I really feel like these connections are really important. And some of the connections I come to or came to by, from thinking about my early work in Under Western Eyes and asking the question of what kind of feminist analysis was, or feminist theory was I being trained in, and what was being left out. That was one question. And the other question, which comes actually from my education background, right, is the question of institutions. How are institutions organizing knowledges within our disciplines in terms of the curricula, syllabi, etc., to tell these particular narratives of citizenship, of gender, of race, class, all of these things. So anyway, I'll stop now because I can go on forever.
Well, maybe we can extend a bit. I mean, I think the connections are very clear that you just laid out, but I'll tell you a way I was thinking about bringing this down to earth a little bit, and at least in the context of the U.S. Struggle right now, and the ways in which sometimes the opposition to Trump is getting represented, and like the de-ice sort of training that's going on to try to stop ICE from kidnapping people off the street and, creating so much mayhem and violence. Sometimes ICE opposition is presented without any mention of imperialism.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Without any mention of colonialism, like ICE is really bad because it's outside the law, because it's racist, but without really giving an analysis of why people are coming here and what is the US history prior to when they came here, and how ICE is a and so the word imperialism is literally not often even seen. And,
Right.
and I know there's like, what do you say to the people? Because there's people who want to be pragmatists about this, which of course, as organizers, we can both sympathize with. You want to bring people into the fold before, you know,
Hmm.
creating a litmus test that's a mile long. So if you talk about imperialism, they'll think, "Oh, this is not for me." So what would you say? How can you help me figure out what to say to that kind of concern?
So I think that, and I think this is where, you know, I think it's so important to always raise the question of, you know, how do we understand the US nation, the state, and the kind of citizenship that has been promoted historically, right? And I think that you cannot understand the US nation state as just within its own borders, right? Which are seen as if they are real borders, which they never are and never have been, in fact, those borders. But you can't just analyze what's happening in the US as if there is no history and as if the US only operates domestically. It has always operated in terms of its imperial projects, always. And so that history of empire and the history of domestic rule has to go together. So we can't understand the US without seeing those connections. So this idea of, you know, who is being ICE picking up and deporting people who look a certain way. I remember how many years ago, I think in 2005, Jackie Alexander wrote about the propensity apparatus, you know, which is what was used at that time to talk about, gays in the military. And I mean, those were the issues at that time that we were talking about. And it was that this idea that it is a propensity that allows the state to to sort of criminalize, incarcerate, and deport people. The idea, so there's nothing, quote, real about it, but if you are Muslim, if you are brown, if you are, Latino, if you are undocumented, just that itself stands in for any real argument or any real way of analyzing what makes these people outsiders. So I think that in terms of this particular question, how do you bring people in? I think it's not about talking about the US, being an empire and that US has supported, because you can do a lot of that, how it has supported fascist rule and terrorism and all of this around the world. But it is more about just asking people, why do you think that these particular groups are being targeted? Do you actually believe that everybody in these groups are criminals, are terrorists? Because logically, it doesn't make sense. And honestly, Linda, the organizing around Palestine and Gaza, for the first time, I believe, in this country, has in fact made it possible for people to see US as complicit in empire and, of course, in the project of funding Israel's war. So that cannot be seen only as a domestic issue anymore. It has to be seen in terms of the support of the US to the war, to Israel. So I think that to me, so say the Occupy movement brought the 99% to the surface, right? So there we were talking, I think, in the US, um, quite clearly about class in a way that we were not talking about class before. yeah, about people who had wealth and who didn't, etc. And I think the mobilization now around genocide and around Palestine justice has, in fact, um, made U.S. empire more explicit, that people now can have actually been talking about our role, our complicity in all of this in ways that they weren't before. And I think maybe using that analogy to talk about, because to be honest, there is a lot of empathy for what's going on. There's also a lot of kind of superficial performativity, I think, in this, but there is a lot of empathy. And to maybe make the connection to what's happening with the deportations. I'm thinking about Naomi Pike's wonderful book called um, Bans, Bans, Walls, Raids, and Sanctuary, talking about US immigration in the 21st century, where she very clearly and historically lays out the connections between the Muslim ban, this was Trump 1.0, Muslim ban, the walls along the border, and the raids, ICE at that time, and then what it means to talk about responding to all of that, how all these things are related and connected, and that you can't think about immigrant without thinking about the connections to all of these questions, right? So I think that um, those are the kind of ways I would try to argue for that, because I think it's too. I guess what I think is that this whole litmus test stuff, it doesn't make sense, because the litmus test stuff, I think, is like a very masculinist almost positionality, which is, are you this? Are you this? Are you this? And are you politically correct in this way? I feel like some of the ways that feminists have contributed here is in the way we think about the creation of communities and relationalities and communities of care and repair. If you think about those as something that one is committed to, then the conversations you have to really be strategically thinking about what is it that I need to do in order to both hear and to bring somebody in very specific ways. That makes sense?
Yes, yes. Um, and I think the attempt to change the language in the public sphere, to go outside of the left groups, but like the 99% got taken up in a larger sphere. And that's what I think a lot of people are seeing in Zoran Mamdani is his effect on
Yeah.
the public sphere discussion that is showing a different way to make connections and to identify what the problem is. And I agree with you. I think that the struggle against the Zionist occupation of Palestine, it's always, you feel like one step forward, two steps back, but there's
Mhm.
definitely been progress made in terms of the number of people that see what's at stake and see the level of atrocity. Um, and this raises the second question I wanted to ask you about solidarity. Um, your work really foregrounds issues of identity, which has gotten both of us in trouble sometimes.
Mhm.
It's the politics of identity, the political relevance and importance of identity, as complex as identities always are, and intersectional as identities always are. There are, can pose challenges of solidarity. The connections between the struggles can be clear, but solidarity on the ground can be
Mhm.
a real challenge. And today the rise of the far right is not always white supremacist. It's not white supremacist in India or in Brazil, even in the United States. It has some multiracial support. So as we can't build solidarity just by being anti-white supremacy, because that's not, the far right is very smart and flexible. It's like you're constantly fighting moving targets in the way it formulates its ethno-nationalism. And even when we try to use gender, as a sort of through line, gender is, of course, understood differently in different struggles. So I'm wondering, if you could say more about, because you want to emphasize in the book very much the need for solidarity, the need to create conditions for solidarity. Within feminism, though, within feminism, there's a lot of liberal corporate feminism that is on the rise, that is sometimes seen as the face of feminism in many countries. Can we have solidarity with those folks?
No. Short answer, no. Because I guess I think that the project is very much both really doing an analysis of the way violence works at all these scales and different levels. And so you do that, and at the same time, you have to envision or understand or imagine a future where, in fact, you are talking about different kinds of communities and relationalities and coexistence that is not based on the same hierarchies, the us and them, all of these things, right? So those things are, I think they have to be held together, and they're very hard to do. Because oftentimes, and you know this from even when you and I taught women's studies together, it is really, you are seen as the bearer of bad news. And so you go from there to getting people to really think, how do we create communities that are communities of dissent, but can also imagine different horizons of relationalities, identities, etc. So I think that gender does not, some kind of unitary understanding of gender does not provide a through line at all. Okay, but I think that we need to ask we always need to ask the question, how does, in whatever context we're doing the analysis, how does racialized gender matter and gender non-conforming folks, LGBT, gender in all its forms, how does it matter in the sort of both the analysis that we are doing and the way and what we want in terms of the justice that we are actually seeking? And so both those things have to go together. And I think that, yes, there are some groups of people we will not make common cause with because they are not, on the same page in terms of how they envision the future. So if you are really a corporate feminist who is seeing feminism as making more money, getting a better job, just being a part of a certain capitalist landscape, which is not seen as problematic, then that isn't somebody that I would be either calling a feminist, but also working with. On the other hand, is it possible to bring these people into, for instance, the struggle against genocide and U.S. Policy and support of it? I hope so. I hope I'll be able to have that conversation, right? And that could provide a space to bring somebody into the other struggle. So I guess I'm thinking now that these struggles and solidarities are made again at different scales and in different spaces as well. So I think that some of the best experiments in terms of thinking about solidarity often are in our classrooms, in fact. And I think that we have to think about that in our classrooms as well, not just in movement spaces. But if we care about thinking through how we build different relationships on the ground that are more just, then we have to figure out ways to create them in whatever spaces we are in. And I think, some of the critique of our critique, Linda, yours and mine and others, of the left has been that it has not really thought about sort of a feminist praxis of community building. I mean, I think Mamdani is interesting because I see some of that foregrounded in the movement that made him the mayor-elect, you know? And some of the most impressive people if you listen to them, are the women in these, communities in New York City, like the Bangladeshi community in New York City, and how they talk about organizing and why they organized. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that they saw that he cared about their issues and that he stood with them. Like the going on a hunger strike with the taxi drivers, that was brilliant and important, right? That gave a lot of I don't know. It gave him a lot of credibility. So it's also about how you build alliances and how you imagine your life as enmeshed with other people's lives. And I think that's what often I think that is what we've lost in terms of this neoliberal understanding of the individual, of the fact that we have to be seen as sort of bounded, people who really don't have connections with each other, that our loyalty is, to our own narrow communities. I mean, I often say that, in fact, and this is something my friend Beverly Guy Sheftal always said, which is that if you want to really do important work in the university, you have to think about how to practice active disloyalty to the institution. You know,
Yes.
what does it mean to practice active disloyalty? And I think that's a really wonderful kind of way of thinking about steps towards solidarity building, maybe, just steps towards solidarity building. Um, but Linda, I want you to talk now a little bit, and I want you to talk a little bit about why you think, identity is important and how you theorize and frame identity in ways that, are not essentialist and are not completely constructionist. And I think that that's your work, a lot of other people's work, where and it including sort of Sandra Harding's standpoint theory, but I think going a little bit beyond that, sort of why, there are ways to think about the epistemic privilege of marginalized people that is so crucial to the way we imagine a different world. So, can you?
Yeah. Oh dear, I didn't know you were
I am going to ask you questions. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, I'll say something about that. I mean, I think that one of the things I was thinking when you were describing the Bangladeshi community's involvement in Mamdani is what we saw here on the ground in the city was that, a lot of these folks are not voters.
Mhm.
So they can't vote, and yet there was still knocking on doors and still organizing. So it was a non-transactional relationship with
Absolutely.
the community, which is so different from the way that the Democratic Party
Oh, yeah.
operates. It's always a transactional
Yeah.
relationship.
Yeah.
This was not. This was like community organizing beyond the bounds of electoral politics and what they can do for, for the candidate. And that seems to me to be a form of solidarity that is respectful, that shows like there's something more than transactional payoff going on. There's a level of respect and recognition that goes beyond that. And I think that's what's a good sort of model of a different kind of social movement and political movement that can be an electoral movement, but not in the same way. And
Right.
it's an electoral arena that makes it possible to do, organizing and reach out. And I think, the way I think about the epistemic importance of identity is that, I think in the 90s, the critique that you and I were both impatient with was the idea that we just think we have identities. The postmodernists sort of sometimes said we just think we've just been, it's like ideological befuddlement. We just have come to accept that we have these identities that are given to us, but that they don't. Whereas the truth is that our identities have been the product of struggle and social movements and activism to say, our experience is not your experience. There's group experiences that are quite different of the United States of America and every country. And our experiences are not visible in policy or in education or in curricula or in so many other ways. And so the mobilizing of identities is a way to expand and diversify the public sphere and expand and diversify the way problematics are understood. It's and of course, people with similar identities disagree. We fight. We totally disagree all the time. But what I think, philosophically, is that there's a first person experience. There's an experiential element that is a first person subjective experience that is not fully translatable through words to another person. You can, convey a lot in words and in actions, but you can't convey the entirety of that first person experience, which is why we think there would be something weird today about having a Supreme Court adjudicate laws about abortion with no females on it at all. That used to be done. That is no longer seen as okay. So they find the most conservative women possibly.
Yeah, exactly.
In some cases. But there's something that's non-negotiable about that first person experience. I just did a panel for the American Philosophical Association about DEI. And I wanted to defend DEI, not, certainly because of against Trump's claims about it as being a diminution of quality control. But the fact is that our institutions, and this will bring us maybe to the question about our universities and women's studies institutions, we would never have Latin American philosophy if we had just relied on the normal practices of quality control. Today we have a thriving community of 40 to 50 scholars in the United States doing Latinx philosophy and Latin American philosophy and teaching it and writing on it and developing it further and critiquing it and debating it. That did not exist when I started in philosophy. All of us working on these topics could go to dinner together and sit at a small table together. So we had to consciously, intentionally create networks, newsletters, journals, panels at conferences to create the community to strengthen and enrich the intellectual development of this area. That's
Hmm.
the point about DEI, is that
Hmm.
it's not going to happen on its own. So
No.
the enrichment of the public sphere to be able to actually represent and address the priorities and problematics of all of us, it's not going to happen by itself, because the quality control is like who's published in the top journals.
Hmm.
No Latinos publish in the top journals because
Right. Right.
because it's not we just wouldn't get through.
Yeah.
We're not working on those topics, and the topics that we work on and the sources that, like, I've seen this. You get reviews and they say, I've never heard of these people before, this person that they're citing.
Hmm. And
No,
that's your problem, not mine.
no, they have no idea the intellectual legacy or anything,
Hmm.
because, and in some ways it's not their fault. They weren't taught, but it's never going to get taught unless we intervene.
Hmm.
So in relation to women's studies, you have been, at the forefront of trying to show that gender is not sufficient as an identity through line, as you say. And I wanted to draw you out a little bit on your criticism of academic spaces, even in women's studies. You say in the book that uh, the the social organization of knowledge in the academy encodes stories of the U.S. nation, presumably democratic nation. So one important aspect of anti-imperialist feminist work is the analysis of the stories of nation and of citizenship in U.S. feminist politics. So retelling the stories of nation and citizenship, which may be seen by some people as, to the side of gender issues, but
Right.
you're saying that has to be brought into account. And you say failure to critique U.S. empire allows feminist projects to be used and mobilized as handmaidens and imperial projects. So you
Hmm.
come out really strong about
Yes.
what and it's still going on. It's not like this is over
No.
in women's studies. You call it free market feminism at one point.
Yeah. Hmm.
So I wanted to invite you to, to say more about what we can do to improve the conditions of, I mean, even in this time when, as I said, women's studies is feeling so much under the gun, like we're one step away from disappearing. But I think you're arguing that we need to continue to make the fight for an anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist women's studies.
Right.
Can you say
Right.
more about that?
Yeah, because I've always thought, and this has to do also with the kind of theoretical work I've been doing, is that you can't think about women's studies, the gender, race, class mantra that we used to talk about in the 80s and 90s, whatever. I think that the gender, race, class mantra doesn't work unless nation is part of it as well. And that has been the point in all of my critiques of women's studies, that in it's like the question of intersectionality, which now we have a public space to talk. I mean, everyone is talking about intersectionality, not always in good ways. It's just becomes performative after a point too. But it's also really crucial. But what I want to do is to look at intersectional analysis by also looking at what are the citizenship projects underlying the analysis that we are doing that are, bordered by the nation state. So I always want to ask the question of citizenship. And I think that asking the question of citizenship is the most important kind of comparative transnational feminist question in some ways, right? Is to not assume that it's adequate to really, because the world we live in is completely interconnected. And, we talk about globalization, et cetera, but unless we actually look at colonial legacies, at settler colonialism, at US empire, etc., as um, constitutive of the kind of feminist work we are engaged in, as constitutive of that, because our classrooms are certainly not all homogeneous either, and there has to be a way that people can understand, and that's where the identity comes in too, thinking about identity in this kind of capacious way, that it is really important to not reproduce the kind of nationalist narratives that I think we have, and which does allow for this, it does allow for feminism to be the handmaiden of empire. I mean, literally, and of capitalism, right? And all of us remember the stuff around, Afghanistan and women's sort of marches around, we are going to be freeing Afghan women. Well, excuse me, nobody wants to be freed by you. So, I mean, the thing is, it's a very, um, it's a problem. And I think, Linda, you're right. It's still a problem, right? It's still a problem. So, for instance, we are now talking about questions of authoritarianism and white supremacy and so on, right? And I think that all these are very, very significant, important questions to think about. However, we can't think about them only in the context of US, right? Because Trump doesn't, authoritarianism here doesn't actually flourish without authoritarianism in other parts of the world. I mean, these people have books that they share, you know. We have had the roots of Hindutva for a very, very long time, like a century or so. It's not something that suddenly Modi invented right now. It's become a phenomenon when it becomes a phenomenon when the state managers embody that ideology. But it's been constructed historically for a long time. And again, has to do with understanding of the nation. Who is the legitimate citizen of the nation? And when we define that citizen as male, as supremacist, as homogeneous, as heterosexual, all of this, then we have um, we have a space where unless we actually tackle all of those parameters simultaneously, we are going to reproduce some of the same paradigms, you know. So I think it is still a problem. I mean, I feel like we've come a long way since the 80s in terms of a lot of the theoretical, intellectual work we've done in feminist studies. Um, I still think, and I have thought for a long time, that we have not decolonized our spaces, our institutional spaces, in the ways that we need to do in order to actually um, foreground the kind of theoretical work that we are now very competent in doing. But whether it is something that has, I don't know, taken root, um, I don't know. I think it's ongoing. Um,
Yeah, I was thinking about, as you were speaking about what happened in Iran last year, when you had a movement that was apparently a genuine movement from
mhm,
pro against enforced covering, but it was it was so clear that it was going to get used. It was going to
Yeah.
get taken up. It was going to get supported. It was going to get represented. It was going to get framed in a way. I did an interview with a young Iranian feminist, Nassim Nourouzi, on this, who was just, and she supported, the desire for everybody to have autonomy over how they decide to represent themselves in terms of religious piety. But she was just, from the very beginning trying to talk to people about, notice how this is going to get taken up, and it has. They want regime change in Iran, and they're using this feminist movement to
Yeah.
legitimate regime change and
Mhm.
try to legitimate unilateral military invasions as they did in Afghanistan. It hasn't changed at all. It hasn't changed at all. So I think one thing that your book helps us to see is we need to ask those questions. We have to intersectionalize identity and intersectionalize movements.
Movements.
See
Absolutely.
how they can be, how they resonate and legitimate other narratives,
Hmm.
which is a challenge. It's a challenge of how you both support people on the ground, but also um, make visible what empire and what the mainstream media and global media is doing with
Right.
with these movements.
Yeah.
Um, so citizenship worries me, though,
Hmm.
uh, especially these days. Can we broaden beyond
Hmm.
form? Are you thinking you're you're probably not just thinking about formal citizenship, because in Latin
Mm-mm.
America there's a lot of different formulations of plurinationalism in which citizenship is thought about in a participatory, performative, a historical, an identity, and not necessarily as having the proper documentation papers for this.
No. Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm thinking about citizenship really in terms of the kind of um, understanding, the sort of ideological understanding of who is a legitimate citizen, which is not to say, I think, that we all are really working towards legitimate citizenship. Mm-mm. I don't think that, you know, um, the way the organization of nation states right now has worked very well because most of the nation states have created communities that are outside the community, outside the state boundaries. So I would like to be able to think about, um, I don't know, about how to build communities on how to imagine communities that are not dependent on um, being legitimized by a nation state. I would like to be able to imagine that, because I think, um, but the reason I think it's important to focus on the nation or analyze it is because that is how the world is organized right now. And so you can't not pay attention to it, I believe. And I think, again, um, it is really, I mean, the whole project of, the whole, in many countries, the project of citizenship is the creation of a carceral state. And this is what we have all over. And that is, creation of that state is about really, um, you know, um understanding or legislating who are bona fide citizens and who are not, I think. So it's not about you know wanting citizenship for everybody who doesn't have it. Of course, you need it for those who don't have it in the immediate future, because that's how it operates right now, is the creation of insiders and outsiders very clearly. you know. Um, and I think you can't deny it right now, given what's happening in our streets and all of this stuff, the militarized streets, the everything. And again, um, not unusual. It is what is happening. We see it in India. Islamophobia is across India, Israel, US, straight lines. And the same, the collaborations are completely based on Islamophobia, but also about, creating insiders and outsiders. Again, on the basis of and the construction, ideological construction of a nation, you know? So,
Yeah.
which is why I keep thinking, we can't think about a democratic nation. We're talking about imperial democracies, basically. I mean, what is that?
Yeah, it's not it's not a real democracy. But yeah, I feel I get the both end. I totally
Hmm.
agree with we need to fight for rights to citizenship, pathways, because there's so much arbitrariness and cruelty and racism built into the structures by which states, parcel out dribs and drabs of citizenship here and there, and that needs to be critiqued and fought for. But it seems like we also need the other side of it, is some of the things you talk about as other kinds of spaces in
Hmm.
which, well, the Rojavas, the Zapatistas, used to be, and there's still some spaces, and there used to, in some cities in the United States, they were allowing um, local elections to have non-citizens voting in them as a kind of example of
Hmm.
an alternative, the state determining who has the right to self-determination and to participate is cannot be the only way in which we see this happening, so that everybody else is an indentured servant and subject to the whims of corporate capitalism.
Right.
Um, but you have these other spaces in which people can flex their muscles and can see the possibility of decision making and
Hmm.
and robust participatory democracy over, local, small issues, but local issues that are very important to people, and in which participation does not require that kind of state authorship.
Absolutely.
That
Yeah.
seems to me, and it's and the Trump period, I think we're so defensive, we're not thinking in those terms, but that seems to me to be what we need. Like some labor contracts. I told you before that we've talked about that don't make a distinction between citizens and non-citizens. Everybody
Right.
is represented, and the undocumented are represented. Everybody's represented by the labor contract without
Hmm.
any distinction. We have that
Right.
already. We need to make
Yeah.
that law and stronger, so that um, as well as fighting for state recognition of citizenship.
Hmm. But I think you're right that those kinds of communities and modes of participation exist, in multiple spaces. I'm also thinking about, like, cities that call themselves sanctuary cities, for instance, right? Where what the city government works is, what the city government determines is more important than what the state or the federal regulations say. And that is about a certain kind of participation that is very different. I mean, Ithaca is that and has a long history of refugee communities, and I mean, just a very long history like that, and has to do with who's on city council most of the time, and citizen participation in in both the choosing of the council and then pushing for certain kinds of things, pushing for certain kinds of rights and regulations. So, hi, Ken.
We have so many good questions. I've come on a little early because I
Okay.
want to get to as many of them as possible, if that's okay. This has just been fabulous. And I'm really appreciative, and I know you'll see in the questions everybody feels lucky to be here. The first one was from Sarah. Yeah, you're going to have to help me with her
Miraglia.
last name. Maraglia, who's here. Is it
Hmm.
accurate to suggest that understanding the links and connections between different forms of violence requires an analytical refusal of public and private as separate spheres?
Linda, you want to take that?
Requires, Sarah, is that what you think that it requires? I guess we can't have conversation with her, but I know she works on this. Or is made easier by it? I guess that would be one question.
You could answer either way.
Yeah, I think she's saying analytical refusal as of public and private as separate spheres. And I think in most situations, Sarah, that may well be the case, you know. And yeah, what she's saying is I think public-private itself is problematic. And I think that is true because it's like dividing production, reproduction, right? And we know that given if you actually focus on women and women's work, those divisions don't happen in the same way, in the old-fashioned way. So yeah, potentially that is true, I think.
Hmm.
And then here's a question from Maria Patel. They're kind of two questions, but I think they go together well. Do you think the theoretical analysis of insurgent knowledges rooted in the lived experience of the most marginalized, which is not automatic, non-essentialist, could be further tied to indigenous epistemologies, where knowledge is grounded on particular cosmologies and the materiality of everyday life as expression of political indigenous resistance? Um, and then she adds, in the futures of feminist praxis, how can we foresee a place for indigenous feminisms? I pose this question as a feminist indigenous scholar activist myself working in a context where gender is being instrumentalized for profit, international development, and indigenous women are doing feminisms in their everyday lives, even if they don't call it that way.
Yeah, Mirella, of course. Yes, I think that um, it is completely tied to indigenous epistemologies, and I think that the second question that you're asking is really key, is that in terms of how we envision, because if we are in fact talking about questions of connectivity, of relationality, of the creation of communities on different grounds, I think indigenous feminist praxis gives us the imaginary for that. And for sure, I think knowing your work, I mean, I can see where the development, how it becomes the everyday lives practice of Indigenous women is feminist, but of course is being kind of co-opted in the ways that actually Linda talked about earlier, I think, with the Iranian women's struggles as well, with all these large development projects. So, yes to both questions, I think.
Yeah, and I would add there's a big movement now of what's sometimes called ethno-epistemology, as well as indigenous epistemology and indigenous philosophy of science. So there's more of a recognition among all kinds of scientists that climate knowledge, agricultural knowledge, medicinal knowledge would really benefit from some collaboration.
Hmm.
That's not just extracting knowledge, because if you extract it and then take it over here, you don't really have it. You don't really know what you have. You have to maintain the relationship. That's what I think the best ethno-epistemologists are showing and arguing, is that you have to maintain the relationship a live relationship between communities
Mm-hmm.
have to be able to, and the cosmology question, I just recently read a very interesting paper about how European astronomy learned from Aztec astronomy because the Aztecs were very concerned to figure out when Mars was going to appear on a particular feast day. It's just like we often do, in Jewish and Christian religions, like for Easter or for it's tied to the moon, it's tied to the sun. And you have to know what the heavens are going to look like to know when to properly, do your religious ritual on the correct day. So the Aztecs had a very advanced astronomical understanding because they had a lot of feast days and they could measure, they could predict 365 days ahead of time what, where the stars were going to be, where the planets were going to be. So there's no problem. I think some people hear the word cosmology and they think it's religion and it's going to be anti-science. No, it motivated astronomy. It was part of astronomy from the beginning.
Right.
That's really true.
Mm-hmm.
And very evident, like if you go to the science studies meetings now to 4S, indigenous epistemology is really at the center very often. We have so many questions. These are good. Anne Ferguson asks, I would like more elaboration about feminist praxis of resistance, because I thought I heard we could not make common cause with corporate feminists, but on the other hand, we could ally with them against the effects of imperialist Gaza genocide on some level. I'm not actually sure what constitutes a community in order to think of solidarity building. How does one decide how many communities we are part of or connected to in order to avoid too abstract a community of solidarity? For example, as women across race, class, and nationality, rather than challenging the social and epistemic privilege that some of us have in relation to others. Good, complicated question.
So, can I take this, Linda? Because I
Please.
think that made that point. Yeah. So, I think that solidarity and alliance works at different levels, I would say. And the point I was making about no common cause with corporate feminists, for sure, was, I think I'm clear about that. But what I was also suggesting is that within a large mobilization, maybe there are ways to call in people who we completely disagree with, but who we can make common cause with for a particular anti-imperialist movement or whatever. Now, does that mean that we are creating community? I don't think so, actually. I don't think that's what we are doing. And I think that for, creating communities for me is about literally it's about creating spaces where we can in fact call in people who can be who we can talk with, who we can argue with, whatever, and create some kind of a space of connection and a vision of what it is we want to see in the future. So you're right that otherwise it becomes, community becomes not a very useful term. And I think, in fact, it hasn't been a useful term sometimes because it gets used in very abstract ways. And I think that creating communities is important. I don't know how I would connect it to solidarity building. Again, solidarity building is something very, very particular and has to do with taking up political positions in relation to particular kinds of injustices. So I like to think about creating communities in my classroom. And because we are always talking about the politics of knowledge, I hope that they would, in fact, then go out and figure out ways to think about creating their own solidarities with movements and spaces and groups of people that they are in relation to. So, yeah. So I think that, and the last point you make, I think it's completely true that we actually cannot create any real community if we are not conscious of our own privileges and and relations of power among us. So that and corporate feminists are not the people who I will want to create community with in that way, because that's not, our goals are completely different in that context, I would say. Linda, you want to add something?
Yeah, Anne, hi, who's an old friend of mine, a really wonderful radical leftist
I know,
feminist.
I've read all of Anne's work. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I like the distinction you made, Chandra, between alliance and solidarity and community. And, I mean, sometimes I think it can be legitimate to try to make an alliance to save some lives, to put the guns down, to, limited, very limited. It's not really a solidarity with corporate feminists. And maybe even corporate feminists will never be an alliance because their interests are so different. But sometimes you can make limited alliances to make enough space to build, right? To make enough space and enough peace for a moment to build institutions and organization. So it's a different understanding. It's a different practice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So here's a question from Gail Hamner. Chandra and Linda, thank you for this compelling and important discussion. For decades, I've admired you both, your leadership, scholarship, and pedagogy. My question is about the third word in your title, Chandra, justice, especially considering what Linda has said and what you have theorized about connection and solidarity, and what you rightly insist about the theoretical centrality of nationalism or geopolitics. How do you now understand justice? From tonight's discussion, it seems we can't define it fully ahead of solidarity and strategic connections, but it seems we also need to be agile enough to shift the lived dimensions of justice as our organizing proceeds. I'd love your thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Mm. Linda, you go.
Justice is it's a difficult word because it's like truth. You never really reach it. It's a goal that orients our practices rather than something that is ever reached and can be described as such. But I think in your book, Chandra, it's working as what we would call in philosophy a normative. It has a normative thrust to it, that it's directing us not just toward feminism, but toward just feminism, not just toward solidarity, but toward just solidarity. So it's operating in that way. And of course, it's going to require a very local and particular analysis in any given struggle.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, just a ceasefire in Palestine is not justice in and of itself because of the ongoing. It may be a legitimate goal to create a space, but that's not achieving justice.
Mm-hmm.
But we might call for a ceasefire as a means to to reach that, to as a means to follow the normative thrust of what we're after. Does that make does do you think
Yeah,
we're
that's
nodding your head that you were that was the
Yeah.
way you were using it?
Yeah. No, I think that makes it's an aspirational kind of thing more
Yeah.
than anything else, more than any working out of, because I also don't think that justice is something that can be fully grasped through legislative system.
And there's
You
no
know?
stasis to it. So it's
No.
going to constantly be moving.
Yes.
If we understand new forms of oppression and things are altered.
Yeah.
okay.
Thanks. Mhm.
Here's maybe we'll have time for two more questions, I think, if we can squeeze them in. Ronaldo Walcott says, I would love to hear Professor Mohanty think out loud about the ways in which our global connectedness is also simultaneously with our profound bordered existence.
Mhm.
Who gets to move, who is demanded and corralled to stay in place, essential to what we are living now. Can you speak a little more to the relation between the two? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Ronaldo. And thank you for being here.
Same.
Absolutely clear that, it is the global connectedness has to do with who gets to go where, it's who moves, who can't move. And it is completely about the sort of way that we are, both within national and transnational spaces, the way particular communities are kept in place and others can travel and do travel and cross borders. So, yeah, I mean, that is one of the facts, I think, about how the logic of carceral states and racial capitalism, in fact, works. It is about the mobility of capital and certain sets of people, and about the holding in place and corralling and criminalizing of others. And it's dependent on that. It's not, there is no such thing as free movement for all of us. And I think that this is one of the points that at least I find in the US is so difficult to get people or get people to actually see that your privilege and various forms of your privilege is completely connected to the holding in place of certain other kinds of people. Because the way things work with this kind of understanding of individual freedom, et cetera, it doesn't allow people to see that, these are two sides of the same coin, and it reproduces the sort of carceral capitalist system in ways that are really unconscionable. I mean, which is why I was thinking this whole idea of, centrally, we need to analyze how violence works and how it infuses everyday life at so many different levels in different ways for different sets of people. So I don't know if I'm answering a question. I'm just thinking out loud,
Mhm.
as you said.
I'm going to put together two last questions,
Okay.
and we're running over a little, but I hope it's okay. Uh, Aza Basaruddin says transnational feminist praxis has pushed the analytical boundaries of structures of power and hierarchies, as well as critical subject positionings within and beyond feminist studies, among other key praxes. In this political moment, I'm finding myself needing to think harder about the kind of transnational feminist analytic frameworks that can be helpful, particularly considering the silencing and retaliation against pro-Palestinian and anti-Zionist voices in the neoliberal university and beyond. I'm going to put that together with a question from Beverly Bain
Hmm.
saying, we're witnessing the intensification of the university as a site of carcerality and depoliticization. Decolonizing women's studies and feminist knowledges is now more challenging than ever. The space of the university is no longer one where insurgent knowledges can flourish. Would like you to talk about how, as feminists, we can begin to imagine and create new sites for these knowledges to flourish beyond the university and beyond.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
There's this thing we have in Brooklyn called the School for Social Research, the sort of Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, sort of based on the Frankfurt School. So you don't have to be, a student anywhere, and it's pretty low priced, and it's 5 to 6 weeks. I think we need more things like this. We need more popular education opportunities of different sorts, and in the public sphere, for not just for us giving the education, but also, to create communities of political education and self-education, clearly.
yeah.
And I intend to
Yeah,
participate in these when I retire.
Yeah, no,
Right.
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that what's happening now, and Aza, your question, I mean, it's just it's unconscionable. I mean, it is completely a transformation of higher education, that has been going on for a while, but is now at a place where, because of the mobilization and because of the weaponization of anti-Semitism and the adoption of that in university contexts, yes, faculty are being, penalized, fired, etc. So it is important, and I like that you put Aza's question together with Beverly's, because it is true that we then need to find alternative spaces. On the other hand, we also can't give up the classroom space. I mean, I feel so strongly that we have to be able to teach all the things that we believe in the classroom, because that otherwise there will be generations of students who will will not benefit from some of the stuff that we are arguing here. And yes, popular education, like certain sort of community centers. I mean, there are different sites of insurgent knowledge building. I think we need, and I like, Linda, your idea of after retirement, but I don't think we're going to have to start now. I mean, and I think that in some ways we've been doing some of that in different spaces already, but I wonder if we could be creating more extra institutional spaces that actually function as, communal spaces for these organizing projects and thinking to happen. I mean, I know they happen in certain places, in some European countries where there's a lot of different formations that have emerged, I think, that are small, local, in different parts of the world, that are creating these knowledges and strategies for organizing, I would say.
Well, and I would call attention to the wisdom shared by both Jackie Brown and Zola Eisenstein in the comments down there as like two complementary versions. I feel like you have created a space for that kind of collective discussion tonight, and I'm really grateful for it. And I know everybody on, this was one of the most lively chats, and we have like 5 or 6 questions left over, but it has been a long teaching day, and I have invested in Linda not retiring too soon because she's been had too much to do, even if there are next things to do. And I'd really like to thank everybody for being here, and thank you both, Chandra and Linda, for doing this. It's just been invaluable, and really grateful.
Can we have a copy of the chat?
I think that will be possible. Yes.
Okay, because I'd like to properly look at comments and think through some. So I really appreciate the opportunity, but also these amazing questions from pretty amazing people here, right?
Yes.
So
We're very lucky.
yes. So
Okay.
thank you.
Have a really good night, and thanks everybody for being here. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
You
Hey,
okay?
Linda. Hey, Larry.
He was here the whole time.
He was here the whole time?
Where's
Yeah.
Satya?
Okay. He had to disappear.
Oh, you
Oh,
told
I
him.
was quiet though.
Yeah.
You were quiet. No, Satya's cooking downstairs. But listen, thanks, Linda. This was fun.
Are you exhausted?
I'm a little tired, but
We don't want to cut them off.
We didn't even talk about FMS. There's so many.
I
now
know we
we're
didn't.
talking
I know.
about all the
There
things
was
we
no
didn't talk
time.
about.
Hi.
But-
We're ending.
Okay. We will check in, Linda. Let's check in later.